So, someone who's with this subject being very close to his heart for some time, something that Ian's been looking at, and Chamapesa is hopefully going to be his solution to help kind of meet those objectives. So I'll hand over to Ian Grigg now to present.
Thanks. Yeah, this is my third Coinscrum, I think, and so I've been, it's kind of good to come home and present some stuff that we're actually doing this time rather than talking hypothetically. Okay, future of identity. This talk is about a whole bunch of things, and I have to slice dramatically to get down to a simple message. It's very difficult because we're bringing together a lot of components that relate to each other in difficult ways, bringing them together to create a cohesive whole. But I have recorded the time it takes to do the coordinated entire holistic view, and it's about 5 hours. So consequently, I'm going to have to cut out 4 hours and possibly some more because I'm standing between you and the beers. And so it's going to be, if you like, a bit of a race. And frankly, I don't think I can cut it down shorter, but I'll try and fill in with questions afterwards. The future of identity. This is really, it's kind of an observation that what we are doing has serendipitously discovered how to solve the problem of identity. And I don't really think that other people have figured this out. So it's kind of along the journey we found this, but that's not what we're really about. What we're really about is how we get money and savings safely to the people. And I want to kind of pose some rhetorical questions and perhaps come close to some answers at some point. What does make the money go around? Is it institutions? Is it investment? Privacy? Is it value? Is it belief or security? What is the thing that makes this happen? And I also want to ask, what makes a good community? Are we a good community? Was your school a good community? Is it resilience? Is it knowledge? We don't have a good answer to that, and I hope we get a bit closer tonight. And finally, what is this thing called identity? And what I really want to ask of everybody is, do we actually need it? And do we need it in the form that we have been told we need it? And this is who we are. I mean, does it really matter who we are? I hope we are somebody for some reason, but we have this big group of people that have now come together to support the Chamapesa project, and it's growing and growing and moving forward. But why does it matter who we are? Ooh. And we kind of know that it's something to do with trust. Trust is kind of important, but we, again, can't quite put our finger on it. Is it to do with trade, or is it to do with economic ideas, or creating value, or I mean, what is the purpose of trust, and why do we keep coming back to the fact that trust seems to be important? And why now? Well, it's obvious that blockchain has unleashed a huge momentum in experimentation and delivery of different ideas. But a lot of these ideas have been around for a long time. So it's very interesting that blockchain itself has unleashed all this information and this momentum, but it itself is not the answer. So what is the answer? Blockchain itself, we have this situation going on in the world of blockchain whereby people say that blockchain is going to solve this problem. And unfortunately, I do not think it will. And part of the reason is that blockchain's history of security and privacy is pretty bad. We've got lots of scams, we've got DDoS attacks, we've got defamations going on all the time in the Bitcoin community. These aren't the sort of communities that you want to introduce to your family. These aren't the sort of places where you want to do business. And business itself is probably sitting on the sidelines. Yes, there's a lot of hype, but where are the big businesses coming in? How many big businesses are actually putting the money down on the table? Lots of proofs of concept going on, but for some reason they're holding back. And I would say the reason they're holding back is because of a lack of trust, a lack of safety, a lack of security. A business doesn't want to wake up tomorrow and discover all its capital has been wiped out because somebody hacked a smart contract. And of course, the answer to all this is, well, it's supposedly trustless. We need identity to solve these problems so that business can start working, so that we can start trading and start making some money. That's the canonical expectation, the knee-jerk response. So I like to pose the question, what is identity? And it turns out that there are about 4 different schools of thought. There's obviously the state's view of what identity, and this is like identity documents and birth certificates coming from a hospital and school records and all these sort of things which are formally organized. And in essence, it's what the authority says you are. I am who the state says I am. Another view is corporate. And this is where we talk about Facebook and Amazon and all those big corporations like Apple. And these guys will spend an awful lot of time collecting an awful lot of records. Your bank does this too. It has huge numbers of records about your activity. And from that, it comes up with some sort of view as to who you are. The corporation tells you that you're the collection of its records, its database. A completely different version is yourself. This is the psychological school. You are who you think you are. You are what is inside your head. And the interesting thing about this is that actually that's probably a much more comfortable view of identity for most people, but we can't digitize that. We can't use that in an internet fashion. So it's kind of the best version and the worst version all at the same time. Or at least we hope we can't digitize that. It would be kind of scary when somebody figures out how to digitize your actual self inside your head. We don't actually want people looking inside our heads because, well, that's a bit scary. It's even scary when we look inside our own heads. And then there's the community sense of who I am. I have a name, you all have names, but actually I am the person that you all see in front of me. And you are the people that I see in front of me. So what happens here is that if I have a tight little community, they will have a view as to who I am and they'll tell everybody else who I am. So this is the sense that I am who my friends say I am. And these are 4 different, very different schools. And in essence, what we can do is go down the list there and say, well, what is the comfortable way in which we could start to work with the identity of a person? We don't want to work with the state because the state is much too limited. It also has a problem that it constructs something that works for it, but not necessarily for anybody else. The state's passport or the state's driver's license is constructed with a purpose. It's not necessarily reliable for anybody else. The corporates can't actually share the information anyway, so that's not much use. What's in my head as the psychological sense of self can't be exported. And what we're left with is this notion of community as identity. There we have a sense that we can actually do something. And that's what we're trying to explore. And in that sense, in a community, what we do is we collect our group together and we start sharing activity. So that sense of what we do, that taking the sum of the perceptions of what everybody sees becomes a foundation for identity. We here tonight are interacting. I will talk to some of you tonight afterwards for questions. I've already talked to some of you beforehand. Every one of those interactions could be in some sense captured, digitized and used. We can do a lot of meetings. Coinscrum is a really social place. It's what we do to relax after work. We get together with friends, we have some beers or some soft drinks. It's the sense where we can meet and identify with the people we are, identify you, you identify me. And this brings us to a thing called the web of trust. This notion of a social form of identity was what inspired the early 1990s thinking that we could take public keys and use them to sign everybody's key. How many people here remember PGP? 1, 2, a few, quite a few. Okay, so the notion is everybody has a public key And when you meet, you take the public key and you share that with your friend, and the friend goes home and types on the computer, oh yes, I found that public key, I'll sign it because I met this person. And in a sense, it was this notion that we would create this big graph of connections across the world. But it didn't really work. And the reason it didn't work, I believe, is because having signed your key, all I've really said is I've met you. Or your name is something, or you were at Coinscrum. Well, actually, we don't know, because there was never a standard method for what that link said. That signing thing didn't say what it meant. So all of these links were basically meaningless, and therefore not very useful. But we can do this with names, for example. I can say what your name is, you can say what my name is. If we use the concept of redundancy, if 10 people here were to say that my name is Ian G, which it probably is, but if 10 people were to do that, then what would happen is I would become that person. You could, if you liked, conspire to rename me by just everybody agreeing that my name is something else. And if you all did that, if you all tweeted that my name is something else, I would earn that name. If enough people say that Alice is Alice, then Alice is in fact Alice. If enough people say that my name is, Trump or something, then boom, I become Trump. So, in a sense, the name is something that is already given to you by your community. Your name didn't typically come from yourself. Your name was taught to you by your family, your first prototypical community. Your nicknames come from your friends, who extract these names out of the air in some social context, which is perhaps embarrassing at the time, but fun later on. So that's where names come from. They don't actually come from you, but it's not really enough to describe who Alice is or who a person is. A person is so much more than their name. The possibilities of information to describe a person are practically unlimited. We've got names, we've got dates of birth, photos, and so forth and so on. Those are the official things. But we've also got relationships, who knows who, who's friends with who, who's working with who. There are also things like your experiences and your jobs in your CV, for example. These are all indications of where one person can say something about something else, about somebody else. So we can generalize the concept of web of trust. We can take this notion of having a link between people, and we can say that actually, if we generalize it, somebody says something about somebody else. And we can do it to a standard in some fashion. And that's what we call the edge protocol. If we take those things, those somethings, and call them attributes, and we collect them, you can see, in a sense, we can digitize this process. I can say something about you, and if I do it according to a something standard, so maybe it's the Coinscrum meeting standard, and I say, I met you at Coinscrum, then if you've got half a dozen or 100 of these different templates, you can start to collect digital information and create a set of information over a particular person. So what we're saying, in a sense, is that as you come into your community, into your group, you become the set of attributes that are collected over you, the set of different somethings that are said by each of the members of the group. These things can be collected in a digital fashion, and then you can imagine that you could paint them over the empty circle that is sitting there that is yourself. And then your phone or your device could know who it is simply by the collection of attributes. But there's still a bit of a problem there. Who actually cares about this? If I say something about you, why would I promise to tell the truth? Is there a particular reason why I'm reliable? And actually, for this to be of any use, we want me to make a reliable statement. I want you to make reliable statements. So we need to solve that problem of reliability and trustworthiness. And it's kind of sad. We've been here several times before. The Web of Trust failed because nobody knew what they were talking about. But then PKI came along and it failed as well. Nobody uses PKI for identity. And the reason for this is twofold. One is that there are zero consequences for the person who makes the statement, and that's the certification authority or whoever's using the PKI. Typically, it is designed such that if they make a mistake, then nothing bad happens to them. So consequently, they don't care that much about mistakes. The other reason that it doesn't work out is because it is something done to the consumer at the consumer's cost, but the consumer never gets a benefit from it, so nobody actually ever wants to do it. And social networks have also failed to create a really strong form of identity. And the reason is twofold. Firstly, there are no consequences built into the system. It doesn't matter if you say the wrong thing on Facebook. And also, there's this garbage in, garbage out problem. If you look at some of the social networks, you'll see that they busily collect all this information, which doesn't matter, and there are no consequences for it. So consequently, all this information that's collected is worthless. You can't rely on it because people inflate the grade or play games with reputation systems, etc., etc. And then, of course, you've got blockchain. Blockchain doesn't really help at all. Of course, we could attach blockchain to identity, but the problem with blockchain is it's a public medium and we can't put identity information onto a blockchain. If we do that, we've got the problem of best encapsulated in the European rules, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation that's coming out this year, basically says you have a right to be forgotten. So we can't actually put the stuff on the blockchain because the blockchain doesn't forget. So in a sense, what we're saying is that identity is a really tough problem, but there are some ways to solve this. Firstly, we start with this notion of identity is an edge protocol. That attribute, that link between you and me, is how we should be looking at it. We shouldn't be looking at it as a personal issue. We should be looking at it as a community issue of people to people. And secondly, we have to add skin in the game. There have to be consequences for every statement that is made by some person over another. It doesn't have to be strong consequences. It doesn't have to be a really serious punishment or anything like that, but we do have to raise the bar to get some quality in there. And once we've figured that out, we also have to have a mechanism of correction. And by this we mean a dispute resolution process, which is to say, if you say something bad about me and I dispute that, there needs to be a way to resolve who's right. It's not necessarily punishing somebody, but we need to resolve that situation. And finally, because of the cost of this, nobody's actually going to pay for all that. We need it to be done inside the social fabric. It needs to be done inside the social network, not externally to it. And just to, kind of put that point in, everybody comes along and says blockchain is going to solve this. Well, unfortunately, blockchain is a hammer. And what do we do with a hammer? If blockchain is your hammer, identity is your bed of nails. And I really don't think that you're going to enjoy putting anybody's identity onto a bed of nails. So identity really has been a bit of a failure up until now, and now I want to switch across completely to where we discovered how to do this properly, and that's Kenya. We went to Kenya in 2012, I think it was. We were chasing the next generation of interesting financial cryptography. In this case, it was M-Pesa. M-Pesa is this mobile money thing that they invented out there. And it allows everybody to move money on their phone. And it's been a bit of an economic miracle because what it's allowed is the entire supply chain across the country to smooth out and become reliable. Which is to say, if you recall those movies of Africa, you always see lots of stalls on the side of the street. Now, all those stalls are very small traders. They have supply turning up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and they have to pay for that supply. That supply, whatever they're selling, probably comes from 50 kilometers away, 500 kilometers away. How do they get the money there? It's a cash-based economy. They don't have bank accounts, so they don't use bank accounts. M-Pesa allows them to pay for their goods. Before M-Pesa, you had to take your cash, put it into an envelope, give it to a bus driver, and the bus driver would take it to the city and then would put the envelope in the hands of a bike driver, a tuk-tuk, and the bike driver would then take it to the supplier. And each of these people would take a certain percentage of the money, and you can see the problem here. Pretty unreliable, lots of loss. Lots of loss, lots of slowness, lots of problems. M-Pesa, you pull out your phone, you tap away, the money gets there straight away. It actually solved a huge problem for the entire country, and it is credited with boosting their economy by percentage points. But we're out there in Kenya looking at M-Pesa, and it turns out that M-Pesa wasn't the solution we were looking for. But we did discover there's a huge problem in Africa. And this huge problem is us. We're called the Wazungu. And Wazungu literally means aimless wanderers. And it's the term for white people coming to Africa to tell them what to do. It's, if you like, colonialism. We turn up in Africa, we are actually wealthy compared to them. And therefore, because we're wealthy, we believe we know what to do and how to fix their problems. So Africa has the problem that there's this steady stream of white people turning up, telling them to get into solar or clean water or energy efficient toilets or whatever it is. And all of these projects more or less fail. So we faced a lot of resistance. But we did discover that they had these chamas. And this happened serendipitously. I was sitting there talking to a woman about the notion of how they do things. And I had discovered that the whole place is actually corrupt. By our standards, Africa is highly corrupt. And it is so different to our way of thinking that it changes everything. And this is the big thing that we discovered that changed all the thinking that we did. All our models were upturned because the place is simply corrupt. In our terms. In their terms, they're used to it and they work with it. So I asked how they solve these problems, and the specific thing I was thinking about was, well, if there is a lot of thievery of assets and so forth, how do you save? How do you get your kids to school? Because another thing we discovered was that if you are in any way upwardly mobile, in any way interested in advancing your future, you get your kids to private school. And private school costs money. And there's a big hit in January. You have to pay 2/3 of the fees in January. So how do the mothers save the money to get their kids to school and pay for it in January if their very kids are the ones who are stealing the money? Or their husband is stealing the money and drinking it away? Or somebody else in the village is stealing the money? And the answer was Chamas. She said to me, we come together in our chamas and we save money. That is how we resolve the issue. So what is a chama? It's a tiny group of typically women, most of them are women, who come together in about 5 to 30 people, and they save. And they save for the rainy day, or they save for investment, or they save for healthcare, or whatever it is. Or sometimes they save just for that particular meeting and one person takes the money home. They have a lot of variations. But the key part of it is that they are tiny communities which form on the basis of trust. Because they are worried about losing the money, they only come together in groups where they know each other, where they actually support each other, and they force each other to save together, and they protect each other. So it turns out that they've done a very good job. These chamas are very strong against outside theft, far more than you would credit just from the notion of what we're talking about. They're also strong against inside theft as well, because they have developed their governance techniques over many years. They've been doing this for 50 years or more. And the way they do it, the key to this is that they actually bring the trust in from outside. And then inside, they grow that. They nurture it as a community thing. So in essence, what happens is not only is the chama a social thing, it's a wanted thing. The women want to belong to their chama. And it's so successful that many women are members of 2 and 3 chamas for different purposes. And they have different savings group circles inside each chama. There are something like 1 million chamas across Kenya. And this is a country with 40 million people. So if you think about the number of women or mothers there, you might be talking about 5 to 10 million, that sort of number, or maybe 10 million. So there is a very high density of this group saving thing. And consequently, what we're basically saying is that this is the beating heart of their economy. The entire transport system is owned by groups of women who save year by year and buy buses and then run them on the road. And you can prove this because you can go into Nairobi and look at all the buses. And every one of them will have the name of their chama pasted on the side of the bus. They're actually saccos, and that's another term for a slightly larger chama, but we don't need to get into detail. In essence, the informal sector owns the transport system in Kenya. It sounds great, but there are still problems, of course. Whenever you've got a group of people together doing something important like saving money, it becomes a hotbed of intrigue, there's problems with governance, and it turns out that they are still doing all of their accounting on paper. Only just that when we were there in 2014 or so did the first early efforts at digitization start to come into play. They also have the problem that they actually don't have a good concept for their holdings. And by this I mean the crypto sense. They don't have that really strong sense of what a unit of holding is. And that's because they're working with paper and they can't branch out of that. And funnily enough, although the World Bank and the IMF will say that these are underdeveloped countries and everybody's very poor and they have no money and so forth and so on, it turns out that that's not actually true. The chamas have a lot of money. They actually have too much money. The problem they face is they don't have a good enough investment environment. Once they get their cash built up over time, they don't have enough good investments to put it in because of the same old problem, corruption. It's really hard to then take the hard-earned cash and put it into some other investment because that could fold, it could be fraud, it could be robbery, who knows. So what we want to do is automate their process. And we want to automate it for many reasons, but chief among those is accounting. We want to improve the accounting by using our good, if you like, triple entry techniques or cryptocurrency techniques so that their savings are locked in and given the safety and security that we've come to associate with at least the blockchain technique, if not the environment. You also get the benefits of communication, and that's important from the social network sense. Earlier I said we need a social network in there, and therefore we do need to improve their communications capabilities, but also just the basic efficiency, the notion that the small tests that we've done using our product is that we can cut the time for their accounting process down to about 1/3 of what they were doing before. So the big idea, if you like, is to take Kenya's little chamas, add in the governed community approach that we've actually acquired from somewhere else, in the specific context, the CA CERT approach, and this has also been built into the EOS blockchain, and add some blockchain techniques, turn it into an app that sits on the Android phone, and bring, if you like, the chamas into the digital age. And all of that, these techniques, some software brings that accounting and governance. The blockchain gives us the ability to do a cross-chain cash, which becomes important a bit later. The old system that I used to work on in the 90s and 2000s called Ricardo has this very strong notion of what an actual issuance is, so we can give them strong instruments. And they've already got their community, but it turns out with their community, if we attach in the identity ideas that we talked about before, we can start to socially integrate them. So because we're a blockchain community here at Coinscrum, I've added a few slides for that sort of thing. What does the blockchain do for us? It's essential that we have some form of cash which works across all of the chamas. So the cash that exists in one chama needs to be spendable to another chama. Otherwise, we're stuck with a notion of very, very weak cash units inside each chama. It needs to be a globally done thing. And of course, the way to do that, or the probable way to do that, is to put the cash onto the blockchain, because that way it's fairly accessible by all. There's another problem. Now, I guess I keep stressing this problem that corruption is ever present. It's so strong that in Kenya, when the woman goes to meet her chama, her husband is not allowed to say anything. Her husband normally rules the house, but when it comes to the chama, husbands stay silent. So much so that he just has to watch her going and, he has to fend for himself. But if the chama keeps its records and were to publish its records in some fashion, then the chama would become a target, because it is literally a little pot of money, or in some cases a large pot of money. So we can't take the chama's accounting and stick them on the blockchain, because the blockchain isn't private enough. And once all of that accounting is sitting on the blockchain, chamas will very quickly realize, by losing their savings, that this is not a good idea. So the notion then is to flip that problem upside down. We're redesigning it such that every chama gets its own blockchain, a single blockchain per chama. So if you like, we're designing the world's smallest blockchain rather than the world's biggest blockchain. It's also going to be the world's slowest blockchain. It'll be a block that lasts a month. We're only going to be doing 100 transactions in a month. When they come together in their meeting, they'll do their 100 transactions, create the block, and then turn it off for the next month until they come back for their next meeting. So it's not a scalable thing at all. It's also a very, shall we say, easy governance mechanism or easy consensus mechanism. Because everybody knows each other, they can simply vote on each transaction. They don't actually need something like proof of work or proof of stake or anything like that. They can use the old school technique, which is to vote. It's still a blockchain, but it's, it's changed it so much that it's starting to look like something completely different. And of course, because we're using these digital techniques, we're starting to lock down their records such that they are locked down in their little blockchain, which means that the treasurer cannot fiddle the books. The treasurer cannot change the records. The treasurer can't disappear with all the funds just because the treasurer is in control of everything. But from an identity point of view, it's interesting because the community has created this sense that we are so well trusted together. We can also make statements about each other. We can collect those attributes about each other. We can collect the participation that we have done. The fact that somebody turns up to a meeting and saves 1,000 shillings is an event that can be turned into an attribute, which can be turned into reputation for that person. The group can work that information, and we can do it in such a fashion that the group can keep its attribute information on its private blockchain and keep all of the identity stuff safe and secure as it keeps its accounting and its money. But then if it needs to talk to anybody else, if a person needs to use their identity information, the group itself can create a summary record and thus shield all of the raw data from the outside world. So we get that safety, that security that we're looking for. So I said right at the beginning, these initial questions, what makes the money go round? I believe what makes the money go round is relationship and trust. And if you look at the way these communities work, the benefit of a good community is not its largeness, but its smallness. And also its adversity, in the sense that it is stronger if the outside world is more fierce. If it has to live in corruption, then it becomes stronger. And also that very essential thing, which I think we've been missing in so many systems, there has to be skin in the game. They do this because they've got savings. They have to make the savings, but the savings, the existence of the savings makes them stronger because they know that everybody can be attached. All of the savings that people have can be attached for some reason or another. So what then is identity, or where is it, or what were we looking for? Identity is what you find in strong communities. So that's Chamapesa, an app to do cryptocurrencies as accounting in these very small social savings groups. We discovered the final piece of the puzzle in Kenya, and now what we're trying to do is export that globally. And as it happens, we get the identity problem solved for free. And that's me finished.